Hello and welcome to Chapter 13, Introduction to Psychology. This is the world of IO psychology. This is industrial organizational psychology, the application of psychological principles to the workplace. And pretty much anywhere, any sort of area that involves human performance. So it's related to social psych. There's lots of behaviorism in this. Lots of things about motivation, lots of things about reward mechanisms and basic capacity to be able to do things and whatnot. We're going to be taking a look at the psychologists and others that created this field of IO psychology. Now, my personal experience in that is I have a degree in performance engineering from Boise State University. And this field rose up from industry. A very different source of this material as opposed to other fields of psychology rose from industry and the need to understand individuals at work over the turn of the century and whatnot. So let's get into some definitions here and get this content. The applications of psychology in the workplace. We'll be looking at organizational development, career development, attitudes about work, job and task analysis. And this also includes, one of the important aspects of this particular thing, the job and task analysis also moves in to evaluate the tasks in a job to determine which are essential tasks and which are non-essential tasks. And this is important in the application of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, applies to non-essential tasks. So the ability for an organization to have a job description that includes essential tasks, these are things that absolutely are necessary and relevant to this job, separated out from the non-essential tasks, makes the whole notion of accommodations that much easier. It's a big part of what IO psychology does. Of course, we look at assessment itself, all kinds of assessment of work productivity, assessment of your job skills, whatnot, everything that's in terms of measurement. Consumer behavior itself, advertising and buying patterns, screening for jobs. This is actually one of the first areas of IO psychology that came along is how do we pick the right people? What sort of tests can we give? When we have a lot of positions to fill, and we have a lot of applicants, how do we screen them out some efficient way? And IO psychology has a lot to do with that. Policy development within organizations, work culture itself, that'll be the first area we take a deep dive in. And of course, human performance itself. So let's take a look at work culture, and I'm going to introduce some terms to you, and I want to be clear about what they mean. Formal work culture and informal work culture. That's tempting to jump on the bandwagon and say some jobs are really informal and other jobs are really formal. But that's not the application that I'm talking about right now. What I'm talking about is that in every workplace, there exists at the same time a formal culture and an informal culture. The formal culture is the stuff you learn in orientation. It's in the manual, it's on the videos, it's your instructions. This is how you do it. Let's say you're working at Dairy Queen, you're learning, how applying for a shift works, how the time clock works, how to make different drinks, all those kinds of things. The official aspects of doing work, customer service and how to deal with customer complaints or things like that, the official lowdown about how you do your job. And then as you're there for a period of time, if you begin to acquaint yourself with some of your coworkers, they might inform you of some workarounds that they've had, about the placement of certain supplies, about the expectations of certain customers, and maybe you shouldn't complain about your coworker, that specific coworker, because that's actually the owner's daughter. Those kinds of things that will not be in the manual, but are important to thrive in that workplace. Now, for me personally, this has been an interesting area to explore. Before I taught, I worked in rehabilitation, helping individuals with disabilities regain independence, including going into the workplace. Now, one of the, if I was to list out the barriers that people with disabilities have moving into the workplace, of course, there's all the formal ones, the ones that have to do with learning the task, the ones that have to do entering the building if they have mobility issues, understanding the task, if there's psychiatric or developmental disabilities, those kinds of things, the formal aspects of the job. But truth be told, we can usually get through those. The issue often lies in how does that individual acquire the informal culture that is happening at the same time and is actually a very important part of their orientation. You see, informal culture is not taught at orientation, or at least not usually taught. It's taught through the natural social interactions that you have with your coworkers. One of the challenges of having people with disabilities work in the workplace is sometimes there's a gap, there's a bridge that needs to be built between the individual who has disabilities and the informal work culture of the place so that those individuals can benefit from those social relationships. Those are casual relationships. They're friendships that grow at the workplace. They're colleague relationships that grow where people help each other. And this necessitates some work for that individual to be successful on the job. So that informal part. When I ask you about these things, I'm asking about a single job that has both formal aspects to it and informal aspects to it. Now, of course, another way that we look at screening. Now, screening is some of the oldest areas of IO psychology, dating all the way back to the results of World War I. So in World War I, the Army picked people somewhat randomly to be officers and then the regular troops. This was, of course, disastrous. And so the Army, being very on the edge of how do we create training and screening mechanisms for thousands of people and do this really quick, were some of the first people to hire psychologists that would eventually become IO psychologists to develop some tests and screening tools. These are famous in the world of psychometrics. They're the first tests that were created to gauge abilities of soldiers, and they were referred to as the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. The Army Alpha was true and false, multiple choice, following directions, arithmetic, and analogies to test an individual's capacity for leadership. But there was also one that was created for people who had limited literacy skills. Literacy skills wasn't essential for leadership, I mean, certainly for some levels of communication, but they had the Army Alpha for literate individuals and the Army Beta for illiterate individuals, and they used these tests in order to determine who would be a better officer. Now, these tests have evolved over time, and you may have come across its descendant, I say, looking for the word there. And its descendant is the ASVAB, or the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. If you are interested in any sort of career in the military, you'll be required to take this test. It's a greatly expanded version of the original Alpha and Beta tests. But what they do is determine what you're going to be good at in the military. It's an aptitude test as to defining what careers are you best suited for in the military, which categorizes them along a hierarchy, and the higher you score on the ASVAB, the more choices you have in terms of what profession you'll get into, or your job while you're in the military. So that's a huge part of the history of IO psychology as well. In additional screening, we look at other types of assessment. Again, this is versions of psychometrics, measuring anything in terms of the psyche. We have testing for employment to see if somebody has the capacity to do things, similar to the ASVAB and the Alpha Beta and the Alpha Beta tests. Evaluation processes, any sort of tool that or instrument that is being used to determine how well and rating your ability to do the tasks. Pay scales and pay schedules. These bring us all the way back to behaviorism, where we look at the idea of how often and how much should somebody be paid in order to maintain that behavior over a period of time. So we looked at that reward. Let's say your behavior plan. How are you going to, let's say there's something really important that you worked with. How much are you going to have to pay yourself with rewards, whatever it is, using that word simply, to maintain that behavior over a long period of time? Studies have been done on different types of jobs as to how often they need to get paid. It might be that doing waiting on tables really, to maintain good behavior from moment to moment, the immediacy of tips is a really, really good way to keep that behavior stable. Pooling tips together, an experiment, in terms of how well that works in terms of a team working together. Those are all sort of questions and ways in which we might distribute that pay. Now, in different workplaces, you might get paid every week. You might get paid by the hour. It might accumulate every week. You might get paid at the end of the day. You might get paid by each individual thing that you create or each individual client that you go out to see. Like doctors are piecework. They see a person, they get paid. They see another person. If they see less people, they get paid less. So it's out, you kind of think of being a physician or a therapist in private practice. It's pretty much you get paid for that event. Then you look at individuals that are paid by the week, maybe every other week, maybe every month, and sometimes even twice a year or sometimes once a year, or maybe they just get paid with one big lump sum from a grant and they have to live on that for the entire duration of the grant. All kinds of ways in which people have been paid, and patterns of productivity have been analyzed based on those reward schedules, very similar to what we would do in behavior management. We also have productivity, the measure of productivity itself, and efficiency. Taking the principles of psychology and applying them to how fast and efficiently we work. Then we have human performance, this whole field that I went and studied, and I will tell you that this particular degree that I have is the degree that is proven to be the most useful. I used what I learned in this degree every single day. Most individuals, most peers in that program that I was in were moving on to become training or orientation professionals in large industries. I remember one partner that I had in a group project was the lead trainer for the software that Hewlett-Packard used. That's a company that builds computers, for their sales team. And there was one project that we worked on. It was a real world project. It was a task that they had an update in their sales software that had to be done for 10,000 sales representatives across any number of languages, because it's an international company, all these different languages. They had to learn this new software. The training started Friday and it was implemented Monday. And he had to develop a plan to train and orient 10,000 people over the weekend because the new software was going to be enabled on Monday. And he brought that task to class and we kind of worked out, well, he pretty much did the work. He was already a professional in that, but just the logistics of doing that, and they successfully. We were able to actually see the results of our work, and they were successfully able to transition to new software in 2.5 days. It was pretty amazing to see how that could be done. And that's what IO psychologists will sometimes do. They'll how do I move people in training from one platform to another? Human performance. And that's what I was studying at the time. Now, Different figures have come along in this field. The first one we're going to look at is from 1909. This is Frederick Taylor. Now, Frederick Taylor's contribution to human performance, look at that date. This is right around the turn of the century, the American Industrial Revolution. He introduced scheduled break times. Imagine that. Some of this took a little bit of argument with the management as well. You got to imagine that here's Frederick Taylor going up to the boss and saying, okay, if you give your employees every 2 hours, you give them 15 minutes off, they're actually going to produce more. This was not like it didn't make any sense at that point. But in reality, because of the patterns of behavior, kind of if you graph productivity over a period of time, this would be analyzed in real time. Productivity might go down to a particular point, and if you don't take a break from the work, the productivity is going to continue to stay down. However, if you give a break and then the person can come back to the top again, and this pattern of productivity was realized through the data that Frederick Taylor gathered in the workplace, and in fact, by giving 15 minutes off every 2 hours or giving break times, allowed the individuals to be even more productive, far outweighed any sort of loss of productivity that would come from the 15 minutes. So important and revolutionary things, revolutionary at least to the point that we think that they've always been there, but it took data to convince individuals to make these changes. Arrangements, not only in the physical space, but people on assembly lines, making things close. If the tools that are needed are close by, I would encourage you to go online, go on YouTube, and look up like modern assembly line videos, just to see, and you'll see an individual, they're building something, and you can look at what they're doing, but look at their desk and how everything's arranged. Not only are we going to come up here with ergonomics too, but everything's in easy reach. The parts that they need are right there. Nobody's having to stretch over here to get that, or stretch over here, or they have to go to the back room. Those are all inefficiencies, and the arrangement both of a workstation but also of the entire production line to increase productivity was a huge contribution of Taylor. He did time studies on productivity to determine what should be expected from an average human being on an assembly line, and introduced the idea of human interface design. Now, this is of course a very dynamic field that still exists with us today. We might refer to this as human interface design when we think about computers and how we use icons like folders and trash cans and recycle bins and all that stuff. We use that language and all to make computers easier to understand. Now, this extends into machines as well. Think about the turn of the century. If you have a lever, okay, first that lever has to be geared in such a way that a human being can actually pull the lever. So you have to be mindful of how much strength the person needs to be able to pull a lever. Now, you could just put a steel rod there, but the steel rod might transmit temperature from the machine, or it might have sharp edges. So let's build a grip geared to the human hand on that lever so the person can reach that lever and be able to turn it. That is human interface design. Taking the machine and making it operable within the geometry of a human being. The lights on the panel. You might think about if you've ever seen like old movies and stuff like that, and still in some ways you might see these things. You see buttons, and when you press the button, there's a little light that comes on that indicates you actually pressed the button. That's that feedback mechanism. There's nothing important about that light other than it tells the human being that what they did was sufficient. The light came on. Warning lights, the colors of warning lights, and whether they're flashing or not are all decisions made in order to accommodate the fact that the human being is operating this machine. So they're very pervasive in our world. The arrangement of our dashboard, the use of icons on your computer, the way buttons are arranged on a keyboard, even on an example of engineering in this part would be if you've learned how to type by putting your hands on the home keys, you'll notice that F and J, where your index fingers are on the home keys, have little bumps. They have a little bump to remind you don't have to look down to find your home keys. There's a tactile reference to that that's there. Our phones, which I have an iPhone, and they're more and more they're using haptic feedback, so that when I press something, there's a stimulus that comes through the screen that makes it feel like I pressed a real button. That haptic feedback. And even in gaming, when you see the haptic feedback, that's the movement within game controllers that you see when you're turning a car and it's pushing a weight over on the hand controllers, feels like you're actually turning something. All of these things are on the details of human interface design. A field that combines engineering and psychology. This is actually a really interesting and lucrative field. So pretty cool stuff. And then finally, ergonomics. These has to do with safety, repeated movement, all of these things. These things that we take for granted today, all brought out by Frederick Taylor back in 1909. Now let's look at a couple people here, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth. These individuals from 1912, not too far after Taylor's work. Reducing the number of motions for a specific task. You can see that in those movies as well on YouTube. Worker stress and motivation coming into factors in terms of the workplace. The role of money in motivation. Very cool. And the role of satisfaction in motivation. There was a time when you didn't care how happy you were on the job. You're getting money, that's enough. And it was really these two, husband and wife, that kind of looked at that notion and said, well, money's not everything. Money's important. You got to get paid. You're not going to do it unless you get paid. But people come to work for more than that. Today, we see satisfaction as actually being a very prominent aspect of people's work, particularly in short labor crises, such as we have in healthcare going on right now as I make this particular movie. The healthcare providers not only need to provide pretty hefty incentives financially, but they have to learn to make ways in which to keep their employees happy in their jobs, because those employees can just up and leave and go to another job. Even when I was growing up, wasn't that long ago, but when I was growing up, switching job frequently was actually frowned upon because that made your resume look like you weren't really committed. These days, doesn't matter. If you switch your jobs every 6 months, it will probably, in most industries, will not indicate a problem. It just means you're searching for the right fit. And part of your career exploration process is switching jobs. So very different market that we exist in. Now, just as a form of FYI, in addition to all of this psychology and IO work, Lillian Gilbreth was also a pretty amazing engineer, and we owe her for the creation of the foot lever that goes on trash cans. What an innovative invention from Lillian Gilbreth. Your hands are full of smelly stuff. You want to put it into the can with smelly stuff. The can has a lid to keep the smelly stuff from smelling. How do you open the lid? Let's create a foot pedal so you can put it in. And now this is all over the place. And so just not only pragmatic solutions for the workplace, but inventions themselves to make the work much more easy to perform. Now, finally, we're going to look at Thomas Gilbert. And Thomas Gilbert, one of the more famous of individuals who, bringing into the modern era, created the field of human performance and human factors engineering. Now, the first area that we're going to look at with Thomas Gilbert is the notion of worthy performance. Now, there's a couple things that come from this. So let's look at the theory itself. Worthy performance from 1978 is how much accomplishment for how much effort. This equation being an important aspect of the analysis of your job, the analysis of your work, how you're choosing to do things. Now, use an example from my workplace. There was we used to have a director of advising at KVCC, and that individual spent a lot of time creating a newsletter that he would send out. I believe it was weekly, and he put a lot of effort in this. This is a time-consuming thing, going out weekly. And as it turns out, when we send out an email and you had to click a link, we can count those links. And I remember we were in a meeting one time and he talked about, well, he puts a lot of time, that's the denominator, behavior. What does it produce? What is the relationship to what it produces? The numerator on top in this equation, this fraction. And in fact, it was like I think it was less than 10% of people were actually looking at that newsletter. So he had to come to an evaluation as to whether or not this was a worthy thing for him to do. Is it worth the time putting the effort into this time-consuming task to send out email with all kinds of great information, but it simply wasn't having the impact that he thought it would, and he abandoned the practice. He felt there was probably better things that he could do. So that particular task did not produce enough accomplishment for it to be worthy. So that's one factor in Gilbert's worthy work fact. The other one, which is certainly at the time was controversial and remains so, is mechanization of processes. What we used to do manually, now being done by machines and robots. This is, of course, the second revolution in industry. Gilbert made it very clear that if there was a machine that could do something more efficiently, meaning their accomplishment was way above the behavior of the individual, because the machine allowed an individual to produce so much more, he felt there were certain kinds of jobs that were unworthy of human beings doing. Because if we could create a machine to do that, that's better, not only because it's going to be more efficient and produce more, with less effort on whoever's operating that machine, but human beings are above doing that kind of work. We shouldn't be putting things together when a machine can be doing it. That lowers humanity's role in the world. And so deep philosophy about this, about what should be mechanized and what in terms of how should human beings spend their time. And he felt that manufacturing, in a large part, if it could be created with a machine, that work was beneath human beings. So we have this, kind of, is it worth the effort? And then there's this sort of philosophical aspect of, is it something that human beings should be doing at all? Okay. Now, the next area that we look at in terms of Gilbert's is probably one of the most useful. And again, I talked about the utility of this degree that I have. Primarily in this particular chart. This chart is Gilbert's behavioral engineering model. He felt that this is a great descriptive and diagnostic tool for productivity. And what it does is it takes into consideration two axes. We have the vertical and horizontal axis in terms of factors that influence productivity. For the case in this class, I'm going to use the information literacy paper from psychology, Intro to Psych, as an example as we look at the application of this particular human factors engineering model to determine what needs to be in place and what sort of factors will influence the ability for someone to complete that job. On the vertical axis, we have first the environment. This is stuff that I would have to do. stuff that I've set up in the class in order for people to perform on that particular assignment. And then we have factors that are the individuals, that is, the students' capacities and whatnot. So those two areas, we look at that. We're going to look at environmental factors and individual factors, basically the class and the students. And we're going to look at three areas: the information that's available, the instrumentation that's available, and motivational factors. So let's start with the first one here. We have expectations and feedback. If you read in this chart, does the individual know what is expected of them? Do my instructions inform my students enough that they know what I'm looking for and it's clear? Do they know how well they're performing on that? And are people given guidance about their performance? And I might admit that, in fact, the structure of this class provides, I think it provides pretty good instructions with, sometimes clarification. But do you know how well you're performing? Not until the end. Or an individual who's taking my class would look at, there's a point at which they can submit a draft, but all those processes leading up to it, there's no feedback along the way. The assignment could be structured such that there were landmarks, milestones to be able to get to the final product, but those are not there. And so your guidance on how well you're doing might be absent. So that might be a failing on the environmental information cell in terms of producing the best quality product, i.e. the information literacy paper. Now, we go down to the individual. What skills and knowledge do the students in the class possess? Do you have the knowledge and skills needed to perform this type of done? This assignment requires you to understand writing, American Psychological Association style, that there are resources available to teach you what those things are, what a peer-reviewed article is. All of those things may be new. And do you have the basic understanding of those things to be able to do the job? Then we switch over to instrumentation. Do you have the right tools for performance, and are those materials designed to match and work well with human beings? Now we're looking at the capacity to access the course with your computer. Is the course clearly designed so that you can access it? Can you have a word processor that is able to produce the expectations in terms of formatting, whatnot, those kinds of things? And then we go down into this, probably one of the more important aspects of instrumentation is individual capacity. Is the timing and aptitude equated? Meaning, when you enter into a college class, the interesting sort of expectation is that you finished high school and that you've learned certain things entering into the class. Now, entering into the class, writing an information literacy paper that does not ask you specifically for your opinion and is basically an investigation of the peer-reviewed literature on a particular question, and you're reporting it out, and you're formatting it in APA format, and you're submitting it in a digital file. All of these things, these capacities, are things that you are learning in the context of this assignment. So your individual capacity doesn't need to meet the assignment. That's what you're learning through the assignment. But do you have the basic skill level to be able to do that? There's an assumption coming from high school that if you've completed that particular aspect of education's expectations, you're ready for the next step. That may or may not be the case. And I have students that are in high school, and they don't necessarily, I can't assume that they've finished high school because they haven't, and they have to kind of jump ahead and acquire these skills pretty rapidly. We next move on to incentives, the incentive aspect of the course itself. There's a grading mechanism, there's a weighting in terms of weight assigned to that particular assignment that is consequential to the entire course grade. Are there incentives like that? Is the assignment presented as interesting? how much control does the individual have? The decision on my part to have you pick your own topics was thought out as a way to add incentives. If I gave you a topic or had a list of topics and you had to pick from those, then they may not be relevant to you, and your motivation for doing that may not be very high. By allowing you to explore a personal interest area in here with modifications to that question through the proposal process, I'm hoping to increase your motivation to actually do this work. It'll be useful for you in the short term. Down here on the bottom, it says, is getting a good grade enough driving force for you to be able to accomplish this task? And can you do this work? Or are you going to be frustrated with lackings in individual capacity and skills and knowledge? So, let's say you're struggling with the information literacy paper. You might go into a chart like this diagnostically, and you might say, well, where's the problem? What am I running into? Is it a tool capacity? I have Microsoft Word, but I don't know how to use it. That'd be the instrumentation is okay in your environment, but you don't have the aptitude. You have to learn how to use the actual word processing program. How frustrating is that when you have to go right through learning? You have to basically learn the software while you're producing a graded project. That is stressful. If you already knew how to use Word, then that's not there at all. Are you really invested in getting a good grade? I have heard from students in the past saying, what will my grade be if I don't do this assignment? And there's a grade that you can be assigned. If you did perfectly and everything else, you could still make like a B- or something like that. And if that's enough, I've had people say, well, I'm not doing it then. And they've ended up with whatever grade that they had. So their incentive, their personal relationship with the incentive that I'd put in there to get a high grade was not high enough to maintain ILP production behavior. So this is a good tool if you're struggling doing something and you're trying to figure out, what's getting in the way, rather than just knocking it off for procrastination, which of course, fear of failure and all that stuff. We've had some discussions about that already. This is a good tool to use. So what's getting in the way? What are the barriers for me getting this done? And if I can clear all 6 of these cells, I might be more productive on that particular assignment. So here we are. You can see how broad covering this field of IO psychology is. My experience in that degree, the utility of that information is extremely cool. I'm entirely planning to produce a course at KVCC in IO psychology. I'm not an expert. I don't have a degree in IO psychology, but it would probably be a great course for anybody going into business, or they're going to run your own business, or you're going to supervise people or anything like this. These are great tools to have to understand the dynamics of the workplace. So that's it for now. That is Chapter 13, Industrial Organizational Psychology, and I will see you next time.